So first, let's go back to the Cuban Revolution. Once a Spanish colony in the first half of the 20th century, Cuba was fast becoming just another appendage of the United States. With corporate interests firmly secured in the country, Western-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista carried out a military coup in 1952. 7 years later, in 1959, guerrilla fighters Fidel Castro and Che Guevara led a 9,000-strong army, forcing Batista into exile. The revolution marked the first successful revolt against neocolonialism in history. The new communist government was at odds with the U.S. and demanded Guantanamo Bay be returned, calling it a violation of international law and an occupation of a sovereign land. The U.S. government refused. It was the height of the Cold War, and Cuba's communist revolution prompted Kennedy to impose an embargo and launch the infamous Bay of Pigs operation, a failed regime change attempt in 1961. Top government officials wanted Castro gone so badly that the next year it even drafted plans to kill innocent people and commit acts of terrorism in U.S. cities to create public support for a war against Cuba. Yet it never carried out the operation. Fearing another U.S. invasion, Cuba asked to host nuclear missiles from the Soviet Union, launching the global hysteria known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, a standoff between the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the U.S., putting the world on the brink of nuclear war. The tense relationship escalated one step further in 1982, when the State Department placed Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list, citing its support for international terrorism and revolutionary groups in Spain and Latin America. And it remains on the list today, alongside only 3 other countries in the world: Iran, Sudan, and Syria. Ironic, considering how Cuba has suffered more terrorist acts against it than any other country. According to Cuba expert and author Salim Lamrani, between 1959 and 1997, the U.S. carried out 5,780 covert actions in Cuba, including several bombings that left thousands of people dead. After several anti-communist terrorist attacks were carried out in Havana with connections to the CIA and exile groups in Miami, Florida, 5 Cuban intelligence officers were sent to gather intel on the community. In 1998, the 5 men were charged with conspiracy and 3 sentenced to life in prison, becoming an emblematic symbol of Western hypocrisy in Cuba. The remaining members of the group still in prison were recently freed as part of the normalization process. And after a whopping 638 unsuccessful assassination attempts against Fidel Castro during his 50-year reign, his brother Raul took his place in 2008. University of Havana history professor Jesus Arboleda Cervera explains how unacceptable this historic policy has been for the Cuban people.
It's different to explain to American people is that the United States don't have the right to do that.
Why are they
no here, and not anywhere, you know. What we want is not what the United States wants. And really, the United States don't have a normal relation with anyone in the world. You know. It's a dominant relation, a hegemonic relation with the rest of the world. So we have a very big confrontation with the United States for many things. It's not just an ideological problem. It's a life problem. It's a way of life.
And that way of life couldn't be more at odds still today, where the U.S. government spends $20 million taxpayer dollars on the ground in Cuba to carry out regime change through subversive USAID programs. So while the world celebrates the end over 50 years of Cold War hostility, this tenuous history proves there's still a long way to go before the U.S.-Cuban relationship is ever considered normal. On Friday, Cuban and U.S. diplomats will meet in Washington for the second round of diplomatic talks. But in order to understand just what's at stake here, it's necessary to delve into the most contentious issues at the heart of the negotiations. starting with Cuba being on the U.S.'s state sponsor of terrorism list. According to the State Department, this designation is because Cuba provides safe haven for members of ETA, the Basque separatist group in Spain, and Colombian guerrilla organization FARC. But inexplicably, its own report on Cuba notes Cuba's ties to ETA have become more distant, and that about 8 of the 24 ETA members in Cuba were relocated with the cooperation of the Spanish government. Furthermore, there was no indication that the Cuban government provided weapons or paramilitary training to terrorist groups. But even if Cuba is removed from the list, it will have no impact on the crippling embargo. See, legislation like the Cuban Democracy Act prohibits even foreign subsidiaries of U.S. corporations from trading with the island nation. As a result, Cuba calls the embargo a blockade because it not only prevents American goods from reaching the country, but from any company in the world with ties to U.S. business. And because of this, Cuba is largely caught in a time warp and must rely on 1950s cars and ancient appliances for its technology needs, not to mention the difficulties procuring everything from construction materials to telecommunications networks. It's this purposeful stunting of Cuba's economic growth that has led every single UN member state to symbolically vote against the embargo, with the exception of the US and Israel. Beyond the embargo, though, one of the more pointless disputes is the US's claim that Cuba owes $6 to $7 billion to business owners that lost their companies when the country nationalized them. While Cuba has acknowledged this, the economically distraught nation has zero way of actually paying back the U.S. If reparations are on the table, the U.S. owes Cuba as much as $181 billion as a result of the embargo. And of course, there's Guantanamo Bay, the territory Cuba cheaply leased the U.S. back in 1903 under the auspices it was going to be used for mining and coal operations, not torture and indefinite detention. Raul Castro made it crystal clear that diplomatic reapproachment with the U.S. wouldn't make any sense without the return of Gitmo. But Roberta Jacobson, the U.S. government official leading the negotiations, said Gitmo is off limits. Then there's the so-called democracy programs. Obama has stated the strategy of isolation isn't working, but he's refused to end the, quote, pro-democracy programs the U.S. has been employing in Cuba for decades to the tune of $20 million a year during the current talks. Over the years, the U.S. has employed frequent subversive political campaigns under the guise of aid. According to the Government Accountability Office, typical program beneficiaries include Cuban community leaders, independent journalists, women, youths, and other marginalized groups. Just in the last 5 years, USAID has also built a secret Twitter campaign designed to undermine the government, paid young Latin Americans nearly $6 an hour to stir dissent under the umbrella of HIV prevention, and even tried to co-opt the country's underground hip-hop scene, a movement already very critical of the Castro government. Then there's the question of political prisoners. Since there's no extradition treaty between Cuba and the U.S., an estimated 70 American fugitives are currently living on the island, including Assata Shakur, the first woman to be placed on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. Shakur is a Black Panther sentenced to life in jail for killing a New Jersey cop. However, there's contradictory evidence regarding her guilt. And since escaping prison, she's lived in Cuba under asylum since 1984. Josefina Vidal, Cuba's head of North American Affairs, maintains that Cuba has every right to grant legitimate political asylum to people it considers persecuted. We've reminded the U.S. government that in the country they've given shelter to dozens and dozens of Cuban citizens, some of them accused of horrible crimes, some accused of terrorism, murder, and kidnapping. And in every case, the U.S. government has decided to welcome them. She's right. Perhaps the most absurd example of all being Luis Posada Carriles, a former CIA asset who was involved in the bombing of a Cuban airliner that killed 73 people. Carriles has been freely living in the U.S. since 2005. Lastly, with many Cubans attempting the dangerous 90-mile journey to America, U.S. immigration policy must be revamped. See, despite rabid GOP fear-mongering about immigration, there isn't much outcry about the special wet foot, dry foot status given exclusively to Cuban immigrants. The Cuban Adjustment Act encourages Cubans to emigrate to the U.S., offering them a fast track to citizenship. Cuba has repeatedly cited that the Cuban Adjustment Act violates immigration agreements signed by both countries. So far, Congress has not touched the law because of the widespread support it has from Cuban Americans living in Florida, a base too strong to ostracize. So despite the recent encouraging moves, we mustn't forget the many, many obstacles standing in the way of mutual respect.